If folks can mute themselves, that'd be great.
Okay, so should I begin?
No, I'll just introduce this.
Okay. My apologies.
No worries. We haven't fully began until this comes off. Welcome, everybody. This is our afternoon session of the Rent Guidelines Board meeting of April 29th, 2021. We have invited owner group testimony. We'll be hearing from a series of speakers. I will introduce them one at a time. We will start with Vito Signorelli from the Rent Stabilization Association. Vito, welcome.
Thank you, David. First and foremost, off the record, I would just like to say, aside from one vacancy on this board, we have the same board members as last year, and it's good and refreshing to see everybody doing well, despite everything that we've gone through over the last 13 months. So it's very nice to see all of you, and on behalf of RSA, we hope that everybody and your loved ones continue to do well at this time.
Thank you.
So thank you for having us. My name is Vito Signorelli. I am the Vice President of Communications of the RSA, and I testify today on behalf of our 25,000 members who own or manage the vast majority of the city's rent-stabilized apartments. The swift impact of the COVID-19 pandemic last spring was unfathomable, just as our city was in the midst of one of the greatest economic booms in history. By the time last year's deliberations came to a conclusion, the vast majority of us were optimistic that the impact of the pandemic would not last long through the summer. Many federal and local restrictions began to be loosened, places of business began to reopen, and cases, hospitalizations, and death numbers began to plummet as we approached the fall. The worst seemed to be behind us, but a second wave of the pandemic over the last 6 months slowed down the highly anticipated economic recovery of New York City. From the onset of the pandemic, as building owners were once again left out to dry by state and city elected officials, RSA repeatedly endorsed a robust rent subsidy program to keep tenants whole for the duration of the government-imposed lockdown measures. Although a subsidy program for low-income tenants is something we have endorsed for decades, the time had never been more appropriate for such a program. As usual, the voices of the rental housing industry were shut out, and instead our local elected leaders supported extreme measures, such as the canceling of all rent payments and a third rent freeze in the last 5 years, despite data denouncing that effort. Before this board even had a chance to begin deliberations last year, Mayor de Blasio unlawfully suggested that this board ignore all data and automatically enact a rent freeze without holding any meetings. Although RSA and our industry colleagues fought against this attempt, the end result was inevitable after 2 brief months of deliberations. In a hypothetical world where a global pandemic didn't exist, this board's data justified even a moderate rent guideline increase last year. Nevertheless, our industry took another rent freeze on the chin because we understood the poor economic climate. Fast forward 1 year later, and there's no denying that our path to an economic recovery is within reach. The impact of the second wave of the pandemic is dissipating. Millions of New Yorkers continue to be vaccinated, and business lockdown measures are being loosened or lifted on a weekly basis. The light at the end of the tunnel is well within sight. Despite endless partisan bickering at the federal level over the last year, 3 economic stimulus packages were enacted, providing extended general financial assistance for struggling Americans impacted by the pandemic. On the local level, multiple measures were taken to ensure that tenants would not lose their homes over the last 14 months, including an eviction moratorium that is on the verge of being extended another 4 months through the end of August. Furthermore, although our state legislators have dragged their feet for months while other states acted swiftly, a federally funded $2.4 billion rent relief program will soon be open for qualified tenants, regardless of their immigration status, who were severely impacted by the pandemic. Regardless of whether or not tenants have remained employed, temporarily lost their jobs, began new jobs, or remained employed even after a year, the vast majority have been financially assisted at great lengths through the federal government. Extended unemployment assistance has been provided throughout the pandemic. From the onset, the first federal stimulus package provided an additional $600 per week in assistance, and as a result, unemployed individuals began earning as much as $4,800 per month or as little as $3,400 per month through the end of July 2020. Beginning in August 2020 through August 2021, presidential executive orders and additional stimulus packages provided unemployed individuals with an additional $300 per week in unemployment assistance. Furthermore, New York State recently approved the Excluded Workers Fund, which will provide undocumented immigrants who lost their jobs during the pandemic and were not eligible for unemployment assistance with a one-time payment of up to $15,600. This is truly significant because last year, as RSA made arguments about generous federal financial assistance provided throughout the pandemic, many members of this board were concerned about undocumented individuals who were not eligible for such assistance. This program will now allow those tenants to receive the assistance they were not qualified for on top of rental arrears through the new rent relief program. Additionally, three economic impact payments have been distributed to qualified households and individuals based on current or former income levels. So, over the last year, a qualified family of four received as much as $11,400 in stimulus payments, regardless of their employment status. As you can see, elected officials on all levels went above and beyond to aid vulnerable tenants in their time of need. However, as usual, building owners were left to pick up the pieces. Operating costs rose once again, a third rent freeze in 5 years was approved, and all that the City Council was able to provide was a temporary lowered interest rate for late property tax payments. Once rental arrears are reimbursed through the state rent relief program, that will only make owners whole for any rent that was due to them over the last year. Our question to all of you is, what is to be done about this year's increase in operating costs, on top of last year's operating costs that were swept under the rug in the interest of enacting another rent freeze? What is to be done about last year's first decrease in net operating income in nearly 20 years, a direct impact of consecutive rent freezes and historically low guidelines? This year, some of you may make the case that net operating income has rebounded. However, a 2.9 increase in NOI does not paint the complete picture of 2018 and 2019. Not only do these years reflect the impact of the first increase in 2 years that was enacted in 2017, but also does not reflect the second half of 2019, when the rent laws were drastically changed under the HSTPA. Severe restrictions to an owner's ability to invest into their buildings through MCIs and IAIs will undoubtedly have an impact in subsequent I&E reports. In fact, the number of distressed buildings have already increased, with the highest percentage coming from pre-war buildings, a clear indication that owners of the city's oldest affordable housing stock were already on the verge of no longer being able to properly and operate their buildings before the HSTPA. For 7 years under this administration, we have been repeatedly told that this board looks at all of the data before determining what the rent guidelines should be, when actually many members of this board over the last 7 years have indicated on numerous occasions that their intention was to correct overcompensation of the past. But the numbers do not lie. There was never overcompensation in the past, when the average guideline increase between 2002 and 2013 was 3.3%, while the average Payout was 5.8%. In fact, severe undercompensation has occurred between 2014 and 2020, with an astounding average 0.75% one-year guideline increase and an average 3.6% Payout increase. After the HSTPA was passed nearly 2 years ago, it was acknowledged by many top-level city administration officials who believe that the new laws may have gone too far and that moving forward, adequate rent increases through the City Rent Guidelines Board would now be necessary in order for building owners to keep up with ever-increasing operating expenses and maintenance that was needed for their apartments. Last year was an anomaly, and now we must return back to normal. There is no denying that generous measures were taken over the last year to protect the city's most vulnerable tenants. It is true that the city's unemployment rate remains high at 11.1% as of March. That number, as well as unemployment claims, continue to be on a steady decline and will further decline. We are, in fact, on a clear path to economic recovery. Just today, Mayor de Blasio announced that New York City is prepared to fully reopen 100% by July 1st, 3 months before the next guideline order would go into effect. Millions will go back to work and millions of jobs will come back. Although there has no been direct support of another rent freeze this year, any consideration of another rent freeze is a blatant disregard of this board's mandate, as well as 2 years' worth of data showing increased owner expenses with no property tax relief or any other operating expense relief for building owners. If this board supports anything short of a rent increase, you are irresponsibly assuming that at a minimum, this current crisis has no end in sight and that tenants will never make a complete recovery. We urge the RGB to adopt a range that reflects the commensurate rent adjustments that RGB research suggests as necessary increases. Furthermore, the data in the PIOC and Income and Affordability Report reflect a full year of economic impact for both building owners and tenants, and still recommends that this board consider a rent guideline increase no less than 2%. With that in mind, RSA recommends to this board preliminary ranges for rent adjustments of 2% to 4% for a 1-year lease and 3% to 5% for a 2-year lease. These guidelines would be a starting point for owners to recoup recent inadequate guidelines, the draconian changes to the state rent laws, and reverse the recent trend in which RGB's own commensurate rent adjustments have been deliberately ignored over the last 7 years. Furthermore, pursuant to clarification issued by DHCR in late 2019 with regard to the HSTPA, these renewal guidelines should continue to apply to vacancy and renewal leases. We look forward to working with all members on this board and will continually remain available to any questions or requests from each of you throughout this deliberation process. On behalf of our entire membership, I thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Vito, I have a question. I'm pretty confident you were watching the morning session, but those representing tenants focused on all of the data relating to unemployment and loss of income. And then your testimony focused on all of the government programs that have been put into place to supplement or to make up for that lost income. And the staff took a very good stab in its income and affordability report to try to mesh those two things to kind of get a sense of where tenants are at. But do you have any comments? So you focused on the benefits that the government has made available. How does that net out with the loss of income that people face from extreme unemployment rates?
Well, there was no doubt that in some particular cases, there were tenants who had severe loss of income. The pandemic affected everybody differently, and we are well aware of that. However, there are also, just like in any industry, some bad actors, so to speak, who took advantage of things such as the eviction moratorium that protected even tenants who were completely capable of making their rental payments, but knew under the moratorium that they didn't have to necessarily do that. So it was building owners who ultimately paid the price. At no point throughout this pandemic was any relief directly provided to building owners, but yet we discussed in my testimony the thorough relief that was provided to tenants to generous measures in many cases.
And what's your take on the $2.4 billion relief that landlords are going to be able to access directly in the coming months? What is RSA's views on that?
Well, we're in full support of it. From the beginning of the pandemic last year, when the idea of an eviction moratorium was considered, we strongly touted a rent subsidy program. The issue at that time was that there was no money for it. Unfortunately, it took a little while for federal funds to come into place for that. And it came in the last two stimulus packages that was enacted in December of 2020 and this past March. So with $2.4 billion, it's more than enough to provide rent relief. There's data out there that suggests that there's up to as much as $2.2 billion in rental arrears that haven't been paid. So if that's the case, that would definitely cover. Our only concern is that over the summer, the state, implemented a $100 million program through HCR. And at this point, HCR still hasn't distributed over half of that money. So, we do understand that in that particular program, there were undocumented residents who didn't qualify for that particular money. So that could have had a role in the fact that a lot of that money was not dispersed. We hope that through this program, because there are no limitations as to who can apply in terms of immigration status, that the money rolls out quickly. One of our biggest concerns was that owners can directly apply on behalf of the tenant, which we feel is important because one issue that we had with the HCR program was that it wasn't publicized enough. We took the initiative to constantly give the message out to our members saying, please notify your tenants, any tenants who are directly struggling from the pandemic, that this money is available for them to provide up to 4 months in arrear payments. We will continue to do that with the new rent relief program, but the state needs to do a better job in making sure that this information is put out to tenants so that they're not blindsided when a building owner applies on their behalf, or that they can apply on their own. And we think that should be done through community boards, through public relations campaigns. It would be a shame to see that this money would be gone to waste, because as of now, this money has to be spent The first portion of the second stimulus package requires 1.3 billion to be spent by the end of September of this year, and the second portion by April of next year. Now, we're optimistic that the current administration might provide some kind of extension in the event that that isn't spent. But as of now, time is ticking, and we need to roll that money out the door.
Thank you. Alex?
Thank you. Just following up on that, in the morning session, one of the witnesses talked about that if landlords accept the rental assistance, they're obligated not to raise the rent for the year. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes, that's correct. We do understand that, let's just say hypothetically, the first rent relief payment goes into the account of an owner as of June. The owner is required at that point, from our understanding, that they're ineligible regardless of what this board decides in June, that they cannot raise the rent between June of 2021 and June of 2022. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be a period of time where a lease comes up for renewal during that time, where a tenant could pay as much as up to 4 to 6 months of a potential rent increase, if that's possible. We do realize that it would be an extreme burden if this board does enact a rent increase of any kind, that an owner cannot collect that for an extended period until a year has passed since they took in rent relief program. But the important thing is that arrears are paid. And we understand for a good chunk of the tenant population in New York City that's a priority right now. Many have been without paying rent, for a year and then some, and maybe even more in some cases. So that's the important thing right now. Do we necessarily agree with the protection of not being able to increase the rent for a year? No. I mean, it's obvious. The report shows owner operating expenses have gone up. They went up last year too. That wasn't considered as, the board enacted a rent freeze last year. So it's 2 years of data we're really looking at here, where increases in most components of operating expenses, and yet owners have had to bear these costs throughout the duration of the eviction moratorium, when in some cases, yes, tenants can't pay their rent, but at the end of the day, rent is not being paid, and that's taking a hit on an owner's bottom line.
If I can ask a follow-up question, can you estimate what share of your members do you think would participate in the rental assistance program?
It's hard to put a number on that, but at this juncture in the pandemic, based on the financial situations that most of their tenants are in, they understand that the priority is to make the tenant whole. There's a terrible perception out there that anytime an eviction proceeding is initiated by a landlord, it's because they want the tenant out of the apartment. That's not the case. It's because rent hasn't been paid. And the last thing an owner wants to do right now, particularly our members, is to get a tenant out of their home in the midst of a pandemic that's still ongoing, after dealing with the financial consequences that came with the pandemic over the year. So we can, again, not put an exact number to it, but we know our members are extremely receptive to the idea of being covered for 12 months and in some cases 15 months of rental payments, because at the end of the day, it's going to make them whole and it's going to make their tenants whole. And God willing, in their cases, are either currently employed or on the verge of or getting new work again.
Thank you.
Christina.
Thanks. So I did have a couple actually other questions. Alex asked my most recent one, but you mentioned that the interest rates on late real estate taxes has gone down a little. I know it's incredibly high, typically at like 18%, but what did they reduce it to?
It was down to 7.5%, and it was only for a temporary period. I believe it was only a 6-week window. So, some of them, even in the midst of that city council hearing where they were to vote on the legislation, many council members, I believe it was up to a dozen, came out in support at the last minute of slashing that to zero, which would have been, extremely helpful at the time. But at the end of the day, a cut in the interest rate isn't exactly what you would call relief. All it did was lower the penalty.
I mean, the typical 18%, I understand, is incredibly high, to say the least. So, and even a 7% late fee is high. I understand that. And then my other question was, and I think this sort of goes to the unfortunateness of us not having 2 landlord reps right now to answer my question. So I'll ask you, Vito, as well. And I might, we heard a lot in the morning session about the that ratio of operating and maintenance costs to income and how it's at 60 or 70 and what is the right, I think anybody who could operate a business where they got 40 cents, 40%, revenue would be doing gangbusters. So can you talk a little bit about are there other costs that landlords are incurring? I mean, I know debt service is not included in that, but if you could talk a little bit about other costs that the landlords are facing.
Of course.
That might not be captured in operating and maintenance.
This is something.
Vito, I'm sorry, Vito, could I just tag onto Christina's question too? Because this morning, Tim had said that he wasn't worried about net operating costs, going up to 70% or 75% of total revenue. And if you can comment where you think the danger line is for your members.
Sure. So to start off with Christine's question, one argument that we've made, and I failed to mention this in my testimony, so I apologize. I will be following up before deliberations are over with RSA's annual submission to the board with data that further justifies, our position this year. But the price index remains outdated at this juncture. It doesn't include dozens of government imposed mandates that owners are still required to follow every year. And that's code enforcement fees, oil tank registration fees, local law 11, fire safety notice requirements, local law 87, retrofitting, benchmarking, bed bug infestation, mold and indoor allergen removal. I'm going to highlight all of these other expenses that aren't considered in the price index, but these are expenses that didn't go away. Just because of the pandemic, the city at best provided extensions for compliance deadlines. But other than that, these requirements were not waived. So these were fees that came out of owners' pockets. So on top of not collecting rent over the last year in particular, they had to comply with these regulations on top of the other costs that are considered in the price index. So, nothing stopped on the owner's end. Rental payments might have stopped, but that only did harm. It doesn't end there. The amount of money that's invested into the operating expense of each apartment is crucial. And without that money, a lot of them weren't able to comply with these regulations. How the city is handling failure to comply is up in the air because it's different for every case. But if violations are issued, owners are still required to correct those violations at some juncture and then certify that they've corrected that. So it's safe to say that over the last year, on top of regular expenses, owners have had their hands full. And David, with regard to your question, I think we're at that point now. I don't think, Tim's recommendation or consideration of where that number would be, where owners would be okay in terms of maintaining their buildings, is a fair assessment, because, that at this point, the income in terms of covering increased expenses is so little at this point and continues to be little, as I highlighted, what the average 1 year increase had been over the last 7 years. The data is still not reflecting where we've been over the last 2 years. So we expect that number to still drastically go lower. But to assume that, an owner can be comfortable covering their costs at a higher level is just, it's irresponsible.
Vito, one of the tenant speakers from the morning said that if we voted for an increase, it would create a perverse incentive to encourage owners not to take advantage of rent relief in the $2.4 billion bill. Could you comment on that? So like we understand from both you and from them that if you participate, you get a zero increase for the next year. If we voted for higher than a zero, what impact would that have on the decision making of one of your members? Would that make them less likely to participate? I'm not saying that this would be a reason that we would come to a decision, but I'm just trying to understand the incentives and whether you agree with the analysis of the tenant rep that not a tenant speaker, that there would be a perverse incentive to not participate in rent relief if we voted for an increase.
I strongly disagree, and I'll explain why. Although I can understand why that might be a concern on the tenant's behalf, the fact of the matter is the law is the law. And as it's outlined, as it passed in the budget, it clearly states that an owner, if they accept this money, cannot accept, a rent increase for a year following the acceptance of the money. So one of the things we pride ourselves in at RSA is our consistent communication with our membership. And although the program isn't open yet, we've been hammering out the details of what this program is going to entail, and that the benefits that remain if they accept the payment over, not accepting the payment. So even if there is an increase, it's going to put the owner in a much difficult position. Not only are they dealing with the arrears that they may not have been able to collect over the last year because of COVID related issues for the tenant, but it's irresponsible to assume that they could even collect another rent increase on top of that on money that they haven't been able to receive. So it's crucial. We are getting it out to our members that it is very important that they accept for any tenant that's eligible for this program to accept it, and that at some point during the lease renewal there will be a period, if a rent increase is approved, that they will be eligible to collect that at some point throughout the lease renewal. So it certainly outweighs that there's more harm in not accepting the rent relief than there is.
Christian.
So hi Vito again, and thank you for your testimony. It's good to see you again. So I wanted to ask you a question that I've actually been curious about since last year, but you mentioned in your testimony that it's not true that landlords have been overcompensated by rent increases. And so I wanted to ask you this because Tim Collins in the morning presented some data that attempted to sort of put some numbers behind this overcompensation and 1990. But what's more interesting, is that throughout the 90s and early 2000s, the estimated the estimated increase that would have made landlords whole tracked pretty closely to the actual decision made by the board, and those numbers began to widen around the time of the Great Recession, and are still widening, and only now are starting to narrow with the lower increases and the rent freezes. So I wanted to ask you, it's like basically your response to this data that Tim has been presenting consistently year after year, and in particular, it's like, is there any data that he's not taking into account into this calculation? Any data that does shed more light onto the question of overcompensation that is not revealed by the data that Tim presented this morning?
Absolutely, and that's more data that I'm going to highlight in my submission that I provide to the board within the next few weeks. But again, I focus on expenses that are not included in the price index that owners deal with on a regular basis. We've tracked the same data since 1990 in terms of increase enacted on top of operating expense increases. There were years where property taxes went up near 17% for consecutive years. And the rent increase didn't even come close to touching what the price index average was in total that year. So I'd like to take the opportunity to really dive into that data to reject his notion, and I'll provide that to the board in the coming weeks.
Okay, just as a quick follow-up, by how much do you think? You mentioned that the price index that we use is sort of not accurate, considering that list of expenses that are not included. By how much do you think our price index is off, given all those expenses that you mentioned that are not counted?
You're looking for a particular number?
Sorry, if you've estimated it. It's like, is there a spread between, it's like what the actual expenses are compared to, it's like what we actually take into account in our RGB reports?
Sure. I don't want to throw a hard number on it, only because it'll vary. A lot of these mandates vary based on building size and particular regulations that apply to it. But these are government mandates that are yearly expenses for owners. So if these were factored into the price index, I have no doubts that the number on a yearly basis would double from what it currently is.
So you think it's as much as double? That it's like we're undercounting by as much as half.
these are yearly mandates, and we're not just talking about mandates that have been enacted since I don't know, 2013, for example, because there's been a lot of anti-owner mandates that have been enacted by the city council over the last 10 years in particular. But this is data that the Payout hasn't been adjusted since the 80s, if I'm correct. So we're talking about over 30 years of data that's outdated at this juncture based on the mandates that have been imposed on owners over that 3-decade span.
Okay.
Alex, is your point on this point?
Yeah, it is. I'm a little confused. Are we talking about, you're talking about the Payout, which is a index not based on actual expenses, but just looking at the sort of basket of different kinds of typical operating costs? Are you looking at the income and expense report, which is the actual expenditures of landlords, lagged by a year? And I think Tim's work was based on the income and expense report, not the Payout, if I remember correctly. So I'm just curious, are you referring to the Payout or the income and expense report?
In this particular argument, I'm referencing the Payout. However, annually we do refer to a list of various expenses that owners aren't required to file through the RPIE. And that list is even longer than the brief one that I just mentioned with regard to Payout expenses.
But Vito, just kind of following up on Christian and Alex's point. So if we said there's operating and maintenance costs, and then you have what's left over, or let's say we have gross revenue of a building that's 100. All of these. So I think we've asked this before, but if you could quantify that when you in your follow-up submission and say, this lead regulation, this boiler regulation, this climate change regulation, here are the dollar figures, that would be useful information.
Sure, absolutely. I could put an estimate on dollar amounts for each particular mandate, and then do a number on the whole about what that would do in terms of NOI.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking if you could do that on a per unit, or I'm not sure it would make sense to do it per unit or per building, but think about some way that we could take that information and kind of, evaluate it in the context of our decision. That would be helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think that really would be helpful. Sorry, I think it would be helpful because I think what often when we talk about NOI, like I understand that's not income, but it often sounds like that, like that you take your dollar in revenue from rent, and then you take your 60 cents of NOI, and all of a sudden you're pocketing 40 cents for every dollar. And, I understand that's not the case, but it's helpful to lay that out. Like if 30 cents is going to debt service, like that, and then there's 5 cents going to these other mandates, like that's a helpful thing to understand, like where that balance is. Cause I don't think any landlord's making 40 cents on the dollar of their building.
No, I would be more than happy to quantify that.
That would be very helpful.
I just wanted to make a quick point. We had really great tenant speakers in the morning. And so I think a lot of the questions that we're asking now is in response to work to characterize their work and their reports, and they're not here to respond or expand on it. So I just wanted to make that point. And I'm not, I'm not going to sort of like nitpick or interrupt today's speakers. We'll speak as you will, but I just wanted to make the point that if it's not a forum to allow for a back and forth. So if there is a question about their reports or their work, we're more than happy to let them know, and then they can provide some background to the board. But it is a little. They don't really have the opportunity to come back and sort of expound on it, as opposed to the owner speakers being able to reply to what they've said without a sort of counter. That could be the lawyer in me, but at any rate, it's a reality. So thank you. That'll be all I'll be saying for today. Thank you for the speakers.
Leah, that's 100% true, and that's one of the maybe that's the main reason why. Just a reminder for our viewers why we switch the order every year. So it's this year tenants, owners, next year will be owners, tenants, just to kind of balance that out over time. But then certainly, and I know that some of those same reps are probably watching the afternoon session, we would more than welcome follow-up in response to either the questions that board members have made or assertions or arguments that owner reps have made as well.
And I just wanted to make the point that I believe, and Andrew or the staff can correct me, but I believe that this conversation of additional expenses that the RGB doesn't track is something that we've talked about consistently for many years. And I believe the board actually has listed, and Andrew, there was an additional memo I remember a few years back where you guys went through some of those extra expenses and talked about when they have to get done and all of that information. But I also want to make sure it's understood that when an owner is purchasing a rent stabilized unit, they do understand that they have to keep it up to code. That is part and should be part of how and when they make decisions on purchasing a building. And so for me, from my perspective, it feels like that is a cost of doing business that a rent stabilized owner is taking when they purchase these units. And so I see it as part of a cost that they have to cover as doing business, because it is still very profitable to own rent stabilized units. But Andrew, can you speak about that? Because I feel like I've seen this theme come up in other years, and you guys did actually provide us with information.
Yeah, so I think we have to keep in mind what a price index is. It takes a look at price and change in price. There is some cost in there, but predominantly it's price. So we're looking at a change in cost. So if something goes up, it's going to be factored into the price index as an increase. If something goes down, it's going to factor in. Each one of those items or components, whether it's insurance or maintenance, takes up a certain percentage of owner's expenses, but it's not cost. That's what we do in the I&E. So in years where those particular items may be in the price index, we include them. If there's no change in that, the price of doing that, if the fee is still $75 from one year to the next, it would dampen the price index in a sense, because you're not including that as an increase. So I think it becomes more important in the RPIE data. My understanding of a lot of those costs are captured there, and maybe I'm incorrect with that, but they are part of where the owner could list those costs. But just referring to the price index, it's a price index. We don't take prices for every single item that owners have, because it's an index, and we're not capturing every single item they spend on, but it's not cost, it's price. So it's just the change in that price.
Andrew, where do you think the RPIE captures some of those regulatory burden costs? Would it be in professionals' fees, or where would that be?
I would imagine it would be, or it could be in administrative costs as part of it as well. I mean, I could double check into the RPIE to see if those costs are being captured, but do you have
any thoughts on that? Where it would be captured in the RPIE? If they were captured, where would they be captured? I'm sorry, Vito, did you catch my question?
I apologize, David. You must have blanked out for a minute, so I didn't hear my name.
Oh, sorry.
There was a brief delay, so if it was a question geared towards me, I didn't make out the full question.
Oh, let me repeat it. Do you have a sense where, if some of these regulatory burdens that you listed were captured by the RPIE, do you know where in the RPIE they would be, or that's not something you can speak to right now?
No, I don't think that's something, I think that's something that the Department of Finance would have to, adjust to the forms that owners are required to file every year. But in the past, we've provided a list of miscellaneous expenses that we believe should be included in the RPIE, and I can provide that once again.
Great, thank you. Any more questions for Vito? Okay. All right, our next speaker is Basha Gerhard from Rebney Real Estate Board of New York. Welcome, Basha.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Basha Gerhard, Senior Vice President of Planning for the Real Estate Board of New York. I'll be reading some prepared remarks and then happy to take any questions. So, The Real Estate Board of New York is the city's leading real estate trade association representing commercial, residential, and institutional property owners, builders, managers, investors, brokers, salespeople, and other organizations and individuals active in New York City real estate. REBNY strongly supports policies that expand the local economy, grow and improve the city's housing stock, and create greater opportunities for all New Yorkers. Thank you to the Rent Guidelines Board for the opportunity to provide our perspective regarding rent adjustments for the city's rent-regulated apartments. We acknowledge that the 2021 Rent Guidelines Board Payout study found that increases between 2% to 2.75% for one-year leases and 2.4% to 5.75% for two-year leases are required to maintain owners' current dollar net operating income. In light of flaws that others have talked about, and we have certainly referenced in years past, and that we'll spend a little bit more time on in a moment, and historical misalignment between RGB increases and rising expenses, we must provide a recommendation. REBNY actually recommends a minimum of a 3.9% increase for one-year renewal and initial leases, commensurate with the weighted increase of expenses dedicated to property taxes, given all of these challenges with the other metrics. So I want to spend some time on federal aid and how that can address tenants' needs versus a rent freeze. The scope and scale of the COVID-19 crisis is one that can only be adequately addressed by federal resources. The National Multifamily Housing Council's rent payment tracker found 79.8% of apartment households made a full or partial rent payment by April 6 in its survey of 11.6 million units of professionally managed apartments across the country. This is compared to 82.9% pre-pandemic. The National Multifamily Housing Council has been tracking payments throughout the pandemic. Their reporting found a direct correlation between the improvement of payment rates and tenants receiving direct federal assistance, whether that was through increased unemployment or stimulus funds. Likewise, the U.S. Census Bureau's Pulse survey found that 80.2% of renters were currently cut off on rent payments, according to the most recently available data from the week of March 17th through the 29th, 2021. These findings at the national level are comparable with what has been reported at the local level. In a report analyzing rental payments, the Furman Center found that total rent arrears increased following both the beginning of the crisis and the expiration of extended federal unemployment benefits at the end of July. Furman also noted a concern for owner ability to pay mortgages and operating expenses given these drops in revenue. REBNY has been a tireless advocate for New York City at the federal level, pushing for business interruption programs, state and local aid, reforms to expand the Paycheck Protection Program, and an emergency rental assistance program. REBNY members were the first to pledge a 90-day moratorium on evictions, enter into voluntary rent repayment plans, and in partnership with members for the New York Association for Affordable Housing, founded Project Parachute. Project Parachute is a philanthropic initiative administered by Enterprise Community Partners that seeks to help the most vulnerable New York City renters remain in their homes during and in the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis. The tenant-facing portion of Project Parachute is known as Fasten and began case management in the fall of 2020. As of this month, under Fasten, Project Parachute has provided support to over 1,600 individuals with $2.6 million in rental arrears requested. Importantly, the program is reaching those who are not otherwise eligible for government assistance. 87% of the served households are undocumented, over 50% are single adults. Importantly, as most stimulus dollars and existing programs identify prior housing instability as a criterion for relief, over 80% of the households served under Fasten would be deemed ineligible for traditional voucher assistance as they have no documented shelter history. Fasten has provided key lessons, including the need for trust building and leveraging partners for referrals for assistance. As part of Project Parachute, REBNY has joined with diverse stakeholders, including representatives from Enterprise Community Partners, the Legal Aid Society, Homeless Services United, court-appointed special advocates for children, and NYSAFA to develop upstream solutions to prevent evictions. If the board is looking for a villain in tenant hardship, it is the pandemic they should be looking to. 0% increases cannot solve for tenant hardship and existing rent burden or accrued rental arrears. It certainly won't solve for keeping buildings habitable, safe, and in good condition over the long run. The 2019 data is not just irrelevant because of the pandemic or other changes or methodology concerns others have spoken about in the past and in today. There was a seismic law change in the passage of the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act of 2019. The HSTPA included the effective wholesale elimination of increases beyond those provided for by the Rent Guidelines Board for renewals and initial leases. There are no more vacancy allowances. There's a severe curtailment of major capital improvements and individual apartment improvements, which quite frankly only affected less than 1% of units a year. There is the elimination of luxury decontrol and the elimination of changes to preferential rents within a tenancy. As a result, the burden to maintain quality housing amid escalating costs falls solely on RGB via annual rent increases. This is especially true for 100% rent stabilized buildings who cannot rely on cross subsidization from their commercial tenants in better years or from the market rate units. As we have previously shared with the board, an analysis by HRNA advisors suggested that the HSTPA could dramatically change the economic viability of the operations and maintenance for apartment buildings across the city. Their analysis estimated that within 5 years, approximately 272,000 units could be financially distressed and unable to afford any investment beyond basic maintenance, taxes, and utilities. Already, we have seen a roughly 48% drop in the number of alteration filings in rent stabilized buildings from 2018 to 2020, and approximately 17% decrease between 2018 and 2019. It is not surprising that these decreases in investment have been accompanied by 3 consecutive years of increasing numbers of distressed buildings, according to the board's own 2021 income and expense study. To keep buildings in good physical condition and budgets balanced, this board must take accountability for their role in keeping these buildings financially and physically viable, especially given the new regulatory framework. Data used by the RGB staff to calculate net operating income is incomplete. An outdated 20-year-old analysis by the RGB and the Department of Finance is used as a basis for adjusting expenses downward 8%. Similarly, costs of building facade maintenance, increased elevator inspections, lead paint abatement, and any other government mandates imposed since the price index was last updated 36 years ago are not considered by the board. Further inflating reported net operating income is the universe of buildings that the RGB studies. The RGB excludes data on smaller 1 to 10 unit buildings that leaves nearly 16,000 fully stabilized buildings unaccounted for, while simultaneously including predominantly market rate buildings with abated property taxes through programs such as Affordable New York, or larger buildings that may only have a handful of stabilized units. With 71% of the rent stabilized housing stock built prior to 1947, maintenance and operational costs are a fact of business, with a regular cycle of necessary major system overhauls like gas, electricity, water, boiler, elevator, and roof replacements. It is unsurprising to see increases year over year in operating expenses. According to the RGB's income and expense report, operating costs increased 3.3%. Additionally, the 2019 data shows that property taxes continue to comprise the largest share of owner expenses, averaging 31.2% of all costs among rent stabilized buildings. From 2018 to 2019, the average monthly expense per dwelling unit paid toward taxes increased 6% and change, and have more than doubled since 2007. However, as we know, the methodology utilizes expense data from 2019, meaning that these figures do not capture increases in operating expenses due to COVID-19 protocols. Initial evidence indicates that expenses continued to rise during the pandemic, with reports of price gouging on cleaning supplies and personal protective equipment impacting tenants and property owners, their employees, and property managers alike. During this time of crisis, property owners have gone above and beyond in meeting their responsibility of providing quality and safe housing for their residents. They continue to and must find ways to cover the increased costs for utilities and maintenance, along with continuing to pay property taxes based on pre-pandemic assessments and collection rates. Additionally, at a time in which many of us are at home, building owners have worked to ensure buildings are safe, clean, and responsive to the pandemic, often at significant expense. The 2019 data shows that property taxes continue to comprise the largest share of owner expenses. From 2018 to 2019, the average monthly expense, apologies, this is a duplicate. So since 1990, RGB increases averaged 2.7%, while expenses for property owners increased almost twice that rate at 5.3%. We believe this is the result of a highly politicized process that in some years has certainly favored owners and in other years favored tenants. So while property owners tackle the challenges of decreased occupancy rates, decreased rent collections, and increased costs due to COVID-19, while providing and maintaining quality housing, they must also abide by the additional regulatory requirements that do not qualify as an eligible expense under the curtailment of the MCI and IA programs. To the board member's question, right, what's not counted in NOI or made clear, it's capital expenses like this. So as an example, to achieve our shared climate goals, more buildings need to contribute to energy reductions and efficiencies. As of last year, Local Law 97 now applies to buildings containing rent-stabilized units that are less than 35% stabilized. These buildings must conform to a law that invokes additional expenses that are not subsidized and cannot be captured through rent increases. Failure to comply will result in fines. This regulatory burden.
Sorry, Basha, could I just ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
Could you do an MCI for those costs or no?
No.
And why not? Why is it excluded from an MCI?
You would have to ask the state legislative body why that particular percentage was tied into the changes under the HSTPA.
Okay, thank you.
But that same threshold appears in that law as appears in the amendment to Local Law 97.
So I'm sorry. So the legislature defined MCI to exclude these climate change retrofits.
Correct.
Got it.
So those changes incurred by the HSTPA created a new regulatory normal, the consequence of which is that the RGB is effectively solely responsible for determining whether rent increases will cover rising expenses, and in turn, whether there is sufficient NOI left for ongoing maintenance and capital improvements. The future of the city's rent-stabilized housing stock is in the RGB's hands. This reality is not unexpected and was foreseen by academics, including those at the Furman Center, who wrote prior to the passage of the HSTPA that the board may need to account for these costs when fulfilling its constitutional obligation to provide a fair return. The rapid adverse changes COVID-19 wrought on the market and housing landscape lend additional credence to serious consideration for moving to a new standard formula that inputs various indices for generating RGB increases that can operate independent of political machinations and in real time. A 2-year lag in data is unacceptable most years, and more so today. We therefore continue to believe there are merits to a formula system and would suggest a formula that encompasses a wide range of indices. This would follow other jurisdictions with a similar system and keep focus on adjustments commensurate with operating costs and inflation. This board's responsibility is to provide increases that allow for maintenance of quality housing for millions of New Yorkers. We appreciate that raising rents on tenants seems like a losing proposition, and even a formula would not address this concern. The RGB operates within a broken system that places the role of subsidizing housing, regardless of whether the tenant is in need, wholly on the private sector, and places the financial cost of rising expenses, inclusive of property taxes, whether they can afford to or not, on the tenant. What the government policies in this pandemic and our own lessons from our involvement in Project Parachute have shown us is that direct, targeted interventions make the biggest differences to tenants in need and struggling to pay rent. Direct assistance to owners for public goods also have a track record for improving outcomes. In this case, building quality without relying on rent increases to cover the difference in capital expenses. Programs like J51 should and must be reformed to do this role, to make it financially feasible to bring buildings into 21st century and to also meet sustainability goals. In 2017, building quality was at its highest level in decades. That is not sustainable with de minimis increases. Rental income and capital investment are the lifeblood of rental housing. To change this paradigm in a manner that ensures affordability for tenants without sacrificing building quality will require another seismic shift in political discourse. A regulatory landscape that recognizes property tax revenue will power social programs, that direct assistance to tenants in need while they are already housed provides stability and is effective eviction protection, and to keep rents affordable without sacrificing building quality, abatement programs are necessary. Maintaining the housing ecosystem in a way that balances all stakeholders should be the goal of an administrative body, with the biggest driver of those expenses being increases to city property taxes. This deficit was previously balanced by other statutorily available revenue streams beyond RGB annual increases. Now that the state has eliminated those revenue streams with the passage of the HSTPA, the role of the RGB is more critical to maintaining the economic viability of the city's rent stabilized apartment stock, which is already in decline, the extent of which is not captured by the RGB due to methodological challenges. So again, the 2021 Rent Guidelines Board PIAC found that increases between 2 to 2.75% for one-year leases and 2.4 to 5.75% for two-year leases are required to maintain owners' current dollar net operating income. We would instead recommend a minimum of a 3.9% increase for one-year renewal and initial leases, commensurate with the weighted increase of expenses dedicated to property taxes, given the challenges of our time. It is appreciated and appropriate that the guidelines last year applied to both renewal and initial leases, recognizing the expenses that occur at turnover. The majority of apartments do not utilize preferential rent, and absent a guideline applying to initial leases will not have a chance till 2023 to even recoup a portion of those required costs, which may now include heightened cleaning procedures related to COVID-19. We encourage this precedent to continue. The city has been experiencing an affordability crisis that impacts hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, both in and out of rent stabilized housing for decades. We will also not know the full impact of COVID-19 for some time. What we do know is that direct assistance will do more for rent burden and rental arrears than blanket policies that address neither. We also know that property taxes help significantly fund the programs that can be most impactful. We encourage the board to adopt guidelines that support high quality rental stock and allow for property owners to meet their financial obligations to maintain a functioning housing ecosystem. Again, government policies can intervene for good and at minimum should not cause additional harm. Thank you to the members of the Rent Guidelines Board for considering our testimony.
Thank you, Basha. Before I forget, could I just ask that you send your testimony to Andrew, just so we can circulate it to the board members?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So I have a series of questions. I'm just going to start with one and see if others have questions as well, but they kind of echo the questions that we asked Vito as well. What is the interplay of the $2.4 billion of rent relief? Like if landlords who take a zero for the next year, what's the benefit to landlords of getting the increase from us? Kind of what's the decision making for landlords, given that there's these two competing regulatory overlays?
At first, I don't think they're competing at all, right? The $2.4 billion is to address a rent arrears hole, and the goal is to make a tenant whole for that period of time, and to reduce the potential for a non-payment eviction. So that's a win. That is great, and that's the program we wanted. It's wonderful that we're not dealing with and like parsing through, is it going to apply to undocumented or not? It's very clear. This applies to tenants in need who are eligible to fill the 12 months and, depending again on their AMI levels and other criteria, 3 months moving forward. So without participating in the program, owners aren't going to get that money. So I fail to understand the connection of, oh, they're not going to take it because there's also going to be this freeze.
If they get a zero because they participate in the program, but you're also calling for the 4% increase. I'm just trying to understand the 4% interaction between those two things.
Right. So the guidelines go into effect in October and last from 2021 until any lease is signed until the following year. Mm-hmm. So there's still going to be a gain of some months, and again, some dollars is better than $0. So, and I guess
so it will kick in.
This is good.
Your understanding, Basha, is that it will kick, so that the landlord would put in. Let's say we voted for an increase. They put in the increase, but they wouldn't collect the increase during the pendency of the legislation, right. And then it would kick in thereafter.
Right. And I think, again, a lot of the good conversations that are happening now is what does ongoing rental assistance look like, making sure, we're involved in some conversations for changes to the social services law to make it easier to access things like FAPs and one-shots if additional assistance is necessary. I think those are, again, this concept of direct assistance is what's going to plug the gap for anyone who's not able to handle or pay or fully, I guess, meet their financial obligations. But again, that's one subset of the tenant universe. And we have the entire owner universe in which there are rising expenses. We're going to make our recommendation. We sincerely hope they're considered, but participating in the program doesn't mean someone wouldn't want to do. Again, I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around this idea of like not participating in the program when this is something that we've been advocating for the last 12 months.
Bosh, if you don't mind, I just want to build on that for a second. I think there's a poor perception out there that the rent relief program is married to whatever decisions the local guideline board makes. That's not the case, because let's just say this program is rolled out and an owner accepts the money June 1 of this year. That is into effect that they can't increase the rent at any level until June of next year. So let's just say this board enacts a rent increase of 2%, for example, and a tenant has a renewal coming up on October 3rd. Beginning after that June period next year, an owner can collect that increase from when that 1 year period ends up until the conclusion of that lease. So, you know, and also you also have to consider the universe of tenants that haven't lost their jobs throughout the pandemic, have been consistently paying their rent. And you're telling owners that if you enact a rent freeze, that despite that tenant being financially responsible throughout the duration of this time, that they can't collect a rent increase on that tenant.
Do other board members have questions? I have some other questions, but I don't want to Christina.
Yeah, you know, and this is sort of for everyone, even those who haven't spoken. Local Law 97. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, I'm directing this really at Revenue because I feel like Revenue, I'm sure, has done some research into this. What the cost implications are for Local Law 97? I know at my own institution we are expecting a huge increase in our costs. But if you could talk a little bit about what Local Law 97 impacts will be in terms of costs.
So I believe and this is not my exact area, my colleague works on this, so we can come back to the board with some, I want to say, more precise numbers, but my understanding is we're talking about billions of dollars in retrofit costs for existing buildings. And that is, there is an opportunity there in terms of job growth for sure. But the more immediate timeline is the millions of dollars in fines if you're not able to get the work done, and some fundamental flaws with the law itself in terms of how it looks at electrification as the end goal, not necessarily energy efficiency improvements. So for a building that say may have already undertaken an MCI in the last few years, where they say replace the windows or put in a new heating and cooling system, all of a sudden they're in a really tough spot in terms of like, there's not much more that they can do to make their building more efficient or run in a different way. And they're going to be facing these fines.
And then another question I had was, you know, we've heard a little bit about sort of these low interest loans and tax exempt programs that are available to people who own, to for-profit, as well as not-for-profits that own rent stabilized units. Can you talk a little bit about like how much are those programs accessed by landlords, specifically, obviously the private for-profit landlords, like, you know, just if you could talk a little bit about that.
Are you specifically asking about the hardship form? Like, I guess like
I'm not specifically hardship, like, and I, you know, forgive me, I'm not that familiar with the programs, but someone this morning mentioned that, you know, as an operator of low income and moderate housing, they can access these HPD low interest or low interest loans and tax exempt programs that are also available to the person speaking was from a not-for-profit, but they are also available to, you know, for-profit organizations. And I was just wondering, like, how often are those accessed? Are they very complicated to, you know, just sort of trying to understand those programs? I have a hunch of what it is, but I want to hear what.
I was going to just say, I think it really does depend on the particular program, because each one of these different financing programs has different requirements in terms of, I want to say, like the stabilization status of the building. So, you know, in the testimony I reference, we really need to rework and rethink something like J51, which requires the entire building to be 100% stabilized, but the pricing floor for that program was done years ago. So it doesn't actually account for things like solar panels or a modern boiler system. So I would have to, I hesitate to speak broadly about any of the programs because each one is individually different and tailored to meet, I want to say, different like affordability requirements or different energy metrics. And just generally, yes, they all have a lot of rules attached to them in terms of compliance and reporting. And, you know, I think depending on the portfolio, it makes sense or it doesn't make sense based on that combination.
Sure.
I just wanted to add that for the most of the small property owners, the PPP loans were not available to us. We don't qualify. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear to everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Basha, I had a few other follow-up questions, and other board members feel free to jump in too. You made a point similar to Vito, that the PIAC does not include some of these items of regulatory burden. And I guess I have the same confusion that I do with Vito, which is it really the PIAC that we should be thinking about, or is it really the income and expenses that we're thinking about? Is it really a PIAC question? I don't get it, why it's a PIAC question.
I think it's both, right? And the reason I say it's both is on the PIAC, when we're talking about, right, it's pricing to the point, like, so take lead abatement. Is lead abatement covered in administrative costs? Like, there's the actual paying someone to come in and test, and then there's the physical work that needs to occur in terms of sealing the walls and whatever mediation or mitigation procedures are required or requested. And I think there's this tension there between how do you parse out all of these different regulatory programs. And Local Law 97 and the sustainability upgrades that are going to be really asked of more and more buildings, and appropriately so if we're going to meet our climate goals, right? Every building needs to participate in some way. I think these are the things that we need to further tease out. And to our point, we're using data that's going to be lagging when we're using PIAC and we're using all of these other things. Even I think a memo was referenced from a few years ago. The lead laws have changed, I think, 3 separate times in the last 3 years. So it's one of those things where how do we stay more current and can make a more informed decision?
I just wanted to bring Andrew back because I feel like I'm a little bit confused because I was under the impression that some of the finance data actually captures some of the costs that we're hearing about today. But what I'm hearing right now is that it doesn't. And so I think that that's a question for us not to just ask of people who are testifying, but to actually do our own research to make sure that we as a board are knowledgeable if we're actually seeing these expenses being an issue for landlord, that we should be actually looking at them. So Andrew, can you, I'm a little bit, I thought that they would be included, but it feels like we're hearing that's not.
Like I said before, I'll double check with the, finance with RPIE filings to see if these type of costs are indeed reported by owners. So
and I think
I'll look into that.
I mean, I think the only point I would make is that when we look at affordability for tenants, are we actually looking at, the price of costs of tenants living in the city during the pandemic, just the same way we're looking at landlords' costs? I think intentional. It's not only intentional, but I think that I think that we as a board are trying to find that balance of what a normal market would look like in any other city. And I think New York City is unique because of all the challenges that I feel like all of the panelists, both in the morning session and the afternoon session, are bringing up. But I think that we're also being very critical about every expense that, someone who is running a business, right? We, think about the folks who have to close down their stores, or landlords. I feel like there's so many views that we have to take that I think that we have really clear data on the fact that overall, in the last year, there is no data that's talked about what landlords saw in 2020. And then I think future RGB boards will be able to look at what happened in these years and make the adjustments that are needed to make sure that landlords are run well. I mean, buildings are run well and maintained. But I don't necessarily feel that we know that there is cost is a good enough reason to be increasing rents when we don't actually have data to quantify what that is, other than anecdotal data from folks. Because for landlord affordability, we just went through every little program that maybe a tenant benefited from and highlighted them as tenants are doing fine when we were in the middle of a real crisis before the pandemic, and we're in a worse crisis now during the pandemic and probably after. There are 220,000 evictions waiting in the state. And I think all of that data together with we might think that there's something we're not looking at right now, but we don't know what that is. And I feel like the board should do a lot more to make sure that we're tracking all of the expenses that landlords are having in order to make knowledgeable and decisions based on actual facts and not just what we think is happening across the city.
Basha, I'm going to continue and again, welcoming other board members to jump in. But you made an argument, which other owner reps have made in the past, that we have this big data gap about small buildings. Why do we have any reason to believe that small buildings, see price increases in any way that's materially different than other buildings? What's the evidence for, so we all know that there's a data gap, that there's not the data for the buildings with less than 11 units. But why do we even, I'm trying to figure out, is that a red herring, or do we have real reason to believe that their prices increase at a different rate than other buildings?
The reason we raise it every year is we don't know. Right. And because we're not including them, we don't know. And I think that's in the spirit of, it would be best to make decisions on the best available data and what's available. There's this whole universe that's not even counted. But what I do feel comfortable saying is when you're including buildings that already have an abatement program and are not paying property taxes, and you're comparing that to a universe of buildings that we don't even count that are paying full property taxes, and the expenses in NOI are adjusted on a universe that's not including a very large universe that is paying property taxes, that seems problematic from a math standpoint and from a data standpoint.
But again, and this goes back to conversations in previous years as well. I mean, so we acknowledge that data gap, but we also don't believe that that data is being collected by anyone. So do you have I appreciate the critique, but do you have any proposed solution for your critique?
I think the expectation was that smaller owners were not collecting this information in years past, and that's why it was not requested. You will have the chance to hear from a small owner, and I'll again, I don't want to speak for them, but you should feel free to ask Jan here, right? I imagine anyone operating their business is keeping track of their expenses, and we've already alluded to the vast amount of bureaucracy an owner must go through in terms of documenting many things. This just seems like one other thing. But again, I would defer to the other panelist on this.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you, I'm hearing you say that it would be good to, I'm not sure if I'm saying this tongue in cheek or not, but to actually require that all rent regulated buildings report RPIE data is what I'm kind of hearing you saying, and that the board can make that request to the relevant deciders of that subject?
I think it would be a great start to say, should we see if people are willing to do this voluntarily to start, since the original exclusion of the data was based on a very low return of those filings. And I think it's always worth going back to the broader universe and asking a question again, are you able to provide this in a percentage basis that will make a significant difference for the data that we are collecting?
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Yeah, just following up on that, a couple questions. One is, I guess, would it be possible to get income and expense data for buildings with and without property tax exemptions and abatements from the Department of Finance? That could answer some of those questions. The other point is, I'm really sort of puzzled about the discussion on Payout, and this goes back to some of Andrew's comments, in that it's about change in price, not the price itself. And so the fact that there are some costs that are not included, that may or may not be important. It depends whether or not they are rising faster or slower than other costs. It also reflects their overall magnitude relative to their share of the total cost. But just to say that costs are excluded, I'm not really sure how meaningful that is, because we don't know, if they are growing relative to other costs.
I think these are all fair questions to ask, and I think it speaks to the challenges of dealing with data where there's lags and where there's obvious holes, on using data that has a methodology that was set decades ago, and going back to what universe of buildings and filings and prices and all these things are being fed into. I think one of the other members said this well, like we can spend a lot of time nitpicking each other's data today. It really speaks to the need for a probably more in-depth conversation with all the stakeholders and the Department of Finance in terms of what is collected, what is not, what is classified, what is not. I don't have a good answer for you today about like why this thing versus that thing. It just really, I think, speaks to the overall confusion that these things create when they're set up decades ago and no one looks under the hood.
Well, to answer your question, Alex, yeah, I think you summed it up best, is that if there's a change of cost and whether it impacts going up or down, it's not the actual cost, which is what the RPIEs file. It's a change in price. The methodology may be the same, but the price index has been updated many times. The weighting of the price index is now weighted using the RPIE data. So we're using that. So the current price index was using weights from the 2019 year. In addition, we go back and we look at each year, we look at a different component and we update the items within that component. So we'll take a look at, for example, fuel, and we'll do a update our like who's, of owners in an owner survey and say what percentage are using gas, what percentage are using oil, and what's the total cost going on. So we reweight the items within the components as well. So you may go back to methodology, but methodology of a price index is a methodology of a price index, but it is updated, and we've been doing updates on an annual basis. So it's that's how we do our pricing.
Andrew, who is it, a regulatory decision or a legislative decision to not collect data for buildings of fewer than 11 units?
Yeah, that's a regulatory, the law when it was created. They can voluntarily fill out, if they want, an RPIE form for buildings that aren't required. We've looked into getting that data in the past, but it's just not enough data to make any sense out of it. There's not enough units there or buildings that are filing. Sometimes we'll ask for it and there's hardly any buildings that filed voluntarily. So I don't know if that's the solution. I think you may have to require it in order for us to get to that data.
So it would require a change in the law, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Basha, I have one last question. So you tied your proposal to the change in the increase in property taxes, and I just don't understand why that would be the driver. Like, so if owners have a whole range of, that's just one component of their expenses. So I just why is that the thing that we tie it to?
Because that's the government controlled driver. If we're talking about a government body and we're talking about government derived expenses and to all these other points, right? Like you can slice everything else a different way. The property taxes are the property taxes, and the property taxes, I think in some ways, because you're not inflating or adding other things, right? Like property taxes as a share has remained very consistent of owners' expenses year over year. It's typically a third. And we think that's the just most appropriate at this moment.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for Basha? Okay, so thank you, Basha. Our next speaker is Joseph Condon from CHIP, from Community Housing Improvement Program. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, David. Hello, board members and fellow panelists. My name is Joseph Condon. I'm providing this testimony on behalf of Community Housing Improvement Program. I sent something around to the board. It's a copy of my testimony, also a report on some surveys that we did within our membership throughout the last 12 months during the pandemic to try and collect information on rent arrears and vacancy rates and things of that nature. So feel free to take a look at that as well. CHIP is a not-for-profit membership-based association. We focus on education and advocacy for rent-stabilized housing providers. Our members run their own businesses. They're all manager/owners. They manage their own buildings. They're typically long-term owners. They are usually fixtures within their communities. They sit on local clubs, civic associations, sometimes even community boards. About 50% of our membership have owned their property for 20 or more years, so they are long-term holders. Yeah, I think that's always good to know. I also like to always remind the board that CHIP member buildings and about 90% of all the existing stabilized housing stock are pre-1974 buildings. Most were actually constructed before 1947. I point this out just to remind everybody that these buildings are old. They need constant upkeep, constant capital improvements. And the reason I mention it is just to echo that these capital costs are not captured in the income and expense statement. So they are not captured in the NOI calculation. Capital expenditures are just not reportable to Department of Finance. So I think that's an important thing to mention, and it's why NOI is misrepresented as income. That's one of the reasons. Another reason I also point out the construction date of these buildings is to remind you that these housing providers do not receive anything in exchange for providing below market rent stabilized housing. There are no tax subsidies or other governmental benefits that they receive to offset their costs in exchange for being rent stabilized. So they're essentially unsubsidized affordable housing providers, and they only have this board to rely on for the viability of their buildings. And as previously mentioned, those rent increases go to pay for energy efficient and environmentally friendly upgrades that the city is requiring. So it's not just taxes, the city also requires capital expenditures. There's also need to pay for construction costs for upgrading buildings to be accessible, installing ramps, stair lifts, widening doors, etc. These are all capital costs that are not captured in the income and expense statement. And again, the guidelines passed by this board are the only real method that these owners have to keep up with these types of expenses. The board's data this year does acknowledge that the cost of providing housing has increased. And therefore, housing providers need to be able to reasonably increase rents in order to stay in business. We went over some of the numbers, but the inflation adjusted commensurates call for 2.75% increase for a 1-year lease and a 5.75% increase for a 2-year lease. And we do think that adopting guidelines below those numbers would be a decision by the board to ignore the data. And although this board has sort of justified ignoring the data historically based on tenant affordability concerns, with monumental rent relief available to tenants and protections from rent increases and evictions as part of that relief, it would appear that those concerns are not as significant this year. So that there is $2.4 billion for retroactive and prospective rent relief for low-income families. Anyone who qualified for unemployment will also potentially qualify for that rent relief. It's that simple. I know there's a lot of talk about the unemployment numbers and how many people qualified for unemployment. Every single one of those people can also qualify for rent relief. And aside from those protections, there's also the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, which is state legislation, which prevents evictions for rent arrears that were accrued during COVID-19. That applies regardless of whether the rent relief is accepted or not. So I just wanted to mention that as well. As far as data, aside from the RGB reports, we also have data on rent stabilized housing providers and how they have fared over the past year. We've surveyed membership basically on a monthly basis since April 2020. We've collected responses on rent collections, vacancy rates, operating expenses, and other things impacted by the pandemic. Again, you can check the report out that we put in the submission, and we're of course happy to answer any follow-up questions on that or go a little bit further into the data than what we reported. But generally, NOI at most buildings has declined significantly in 2020. And just as the board considered more current data in its deliberations last year that projected significant tenant hardship, we asked the board to consider more current data this year on building finances and housing provider hardship. Two things especially that I want to highlight from the survey report are that overall operating costs increased by 10% in 2020, and overall operating income declined by 22% in 2020. So if we apply those rates to the figures that were in this year's I&E report, we would see that NOI for 2020 is $83 per unit, which is down from $556 per unit in this year's report. Rent stabilized housing providers, however, have been feeling pressure, not this much pressure, but they have been feeling pressure on their operating budgets from even before COVID-19. NOI has actually been decreasing since the 2018 I&E report. At that point, it was 64% above the 1990 level. Right now, it is at 52% above the 1990 level. So it is still coming down, despite the slight uptick this year. It is still well below that 2018 level, and NOI is actually closer to its 2014 level. Unfortunately, housing providers cannot say the same for their property tax levies or any other expenses. There are no expenses that are decreasing to their 2014 levels. And yeah, expenses to run buildings are not going down. See what else I would like to mention. Yes, just, this board, look, the board decision applies to all 1 million rent stabilized households, regardless of their situation, whether they can pay or not, whether they lost a job or not. And it's difficult, but navigating this type of detail and nuance really is supposed to be done through legislation, not through this board, and especially not through adopting a single rate for all 1 million households. So while CHIP and its members are deeply concerned with the issue of housing affordability, we do not believe it is the proper forum, or this is the proper forum for the discussion. And certainly this board does not possess the tools to address the complexity of the housing affordability crisis. The RSL itself is not an affordable housing program, or at least it's not supposed to be. It's intended to prevent speculation and profiteering and displacement effects that those cause. The commensurate adjustments in the Payout report sort of perform the function of preventing unreasonable rent increases by establishing the minimum rent increase necessary just to meet expenses. So while CHIP is more than willing to explore reasonable policy solutions, we just don't think this is the proper place for the discussion. And in line with this year's PIAC and operating expenses, and given prior years, this year we recommend a 4% increase on a 1-year lease and a 5.5% increase on a 2-year lease. We do also urge the board to continue to authorize the rent increases that are adopted to also apply to vacancy leases. Allowing guidelines to apply to vacancy leases reduces the rent increase necessary on renewal leases. So for example, if you look at the commensurates in this year's report, without applying to vacancy leases, the commensurate would be 2.75 and 5.75. But if you do apply the order to vacancy leases, those commensurates would decrease to 2.5 and 4.5 respectively. The one other thing that I do want to mention is sort of on the NOI point again, and sort of I think I've mentioned this before, but I did want to bring it up since we are talking about NOI. The methodology the board uses actually double counts NOI, double counts increases in building revenue from capital improvements. That's because it does not account for the cost of capital improvements. Those are not reported in income expense, and there is no other method of that the board uses to collect those costs. But it does count rent increases that have resulted from those capital improvements. So what the board does is it counts the rent increases from MCIs or whatnot, but does not count the expense for those improvements. And so it has a double counting effect, so to speak. So we just want to raise that again. It's just another example of how NOI is really distorted and not a complete picture of expenses for buildings, rent stabilized buildings. That's all I really have. You can read my testimony. There's a little bit more in there, more detail, but that's it for now. Happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Joe. Questions from members? I know I have questions, but let me open it up to others first. Joe, I'd like to take a deep dive into your survey, and in large part, I don't know if you had a chance to attend our last meeting, but where we heard from representatives of Community Preservation Corporation and from M&T Bank. And when they talked about their portfolios, they didn't describe them as in nearly as much distress as you're describing the CHIP member survey, the survey of CHIP members. And I'm just trying to get my head around why it would look so different.
I don't know the reasons. I mean, I don't know. 10%. I did attend that. I thought they actually said their operating costs were increased by more than 10%. So I thought they were up around like 18% actually.
That was just a component of their operating. That was just was it labor or Andrew? Do you remember? Or
I think I asked a question about union labor, and that's when that cost increase came.
It was just there was one component of their costs, I think.
Yeah, I believe it was maintenance that they said went a lot.
And then there was a little lack of clarity as to whether their labor, like their labor was low, but their maintenance was high, and the RGB staff, it was the opposite or something like that. But it kind of netted out. It kind of netted out to the same place where the RGB staff came when you added in all the expenses. It kind of was roughly in the same ballpark, within a percentage point or two, I think.
No, I'm sorry. It was, let's see. Yeah, it actually is labor costs were up significantly higher. Maintenance was down as compared to the RGB for 29, the RPIE 2019 data. But is the CPC data from the same year? I don't know. I don't want to speak about the data in state. No, it is CPC 2019 expense information. Yeah. So where it differed was they were spending more in labor and less in maintenance, and that's 2019 though. It's not.
We're talking 20. So we surveyed our members from 2020.
Yeah, it's two different time periods.
Wait, but they were kind of talking about loans in default, loans in forbearance, and
sorry,
collections, and they were talking about collections, and it just seems like the numbers from those two portfolios were not nearly as bad as what your numbers are. I'm just trying to understand, like,
I mean, the difference could be well, I think a lot of those are not for profit housing providers. So the universe that we surveyed are all privately owned housing providers. I don't know if that comes into play a little bit.
I would assume that if your NOI goes down to $83 a unit per month, down from $556 a month, that you'd have a really hard time like paying your debt service. I would think like that, and so like, do you survey about how many of them are in forbearance or in default on their loans?
We did have surveys about tax defaults and tax payment delays or defaults. I could share those with you as well.
That'd be great. But nothing about loan defaults or forbearances.
I don't think we asked that question. No.
Okay. All right. And then the impact of the rent relief, the 2.4 billion. So you had this massive drop in 2020, but then I'm not going to call it a windfall, but then you're going to kind of get this massive, to the extent that your members participate in the rent relief, they will get a massive infusion of income when that comes through. I'm just confirming that is true.
I'm sorry, say that,
So
the
you
rent
showed a
relief will,
massive drop in income in
Mhm.
2020, which makes sense. But once the rent relief comes through, you will have a massive one-time infusion of income if they participate in the program, right?
there will be I mean, presumably there will be some certain an infusion, right? That will cover the arrears. But that really goes to the fact that, you know, this housing was being provided essentially at no cost for the last, I don't know, 13, 14 months or however long it may be. So yeah, I don't necessarily know that it will balance out entirely, but certainly the rent relief is helpful.
And
David, I think it's a little unfair to call that an infusion of income. That's rent that's owed, that's being
Right.
back to the property owner.
but I mean, on an accounting basis, it would be reflected as a massive. I'm not saying that it's a massive increase in profitability, but it's a massive increase in your 2021 income if you kind of got this all in one payment, right? I mean,
I think the other part that's important to note is that the loss in operating income also comes from the significant vacancy rate that is occurring in a lot of buildings. So I think our estimate or our survey showed that of the total lost income, about half of it was from rent arrears, and then half of it was from vacancies and the inability to collect money from those units.
so have any of the owner organizations tried to look and see, like, if we looked at our 2020 balance sheet and or our 2020 income statement and our 2021 income statement and combine the two, have you modeled, how much worse off owners are as when you net out the pandemic and then the rent relief? Has anyone started to kind of think about it that way?
The vacancy increases, I mean, the vacancy losses, I think, have a bigger impact than are a bigger chunk of the overall losses than the rent arrears.
And does your survey include reporting on vacancies?
Yes.
And is that included in what you gave us, or could you give it to us if it wasn't?
Yes, I believe so. There should be a chart in there. Should be on the last page.
Yeah, I see. So
So we started asking about how many units are vacant, and you'll see it's 10% or higher for each month.
And what was it pre-pandemic?
About anywhere from 3 to 4%.
Other questions for Joe? Okay, Joe, thanks so much. Oops, I misplaced my agenda. Let me just pull that up. So Jan Lee from SPONY, from Small Property Owners of New York, welcome. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the board, and thank you for giving us this time to speak. SPONY, Small Property Owners of New York, is a volunteer nonprofit organization founded in 1984. The vast majority of our owners are small families like myself. Many of them we call legacy owners. My name is Jan Lee, and I'm a member manager of my family's tenement properties in the heart of Chinatown. We're closing in on our 96th year of property ownership. My grandfather came to this country during the Chinese Exclusion Act, and despite being deported twice, he finally gained sponsorship and settled in Chinatown. After years of hard work, he managed to buy the buildings that we call home in a part of New York City that was relegated to the Chinese as a ghetto. Hemmed in by racism and hostility, he persevered. He raised his family here, and my dad was born in the 1920s in our building. I'm the third generation to live and manage this property. As I've had the privilege of meeting small owners from all over the city during the pandemic, other immigrants from the Caribbean, Korea, India, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and many, many more. I hear similar stories about immigrants fighting against racism in this city, but having been left to fend for themselves in corners of this city that were not prime real estate. The places left to people of color and Black owners were for the most part undesirable and therefore affordable at the time. It was up to us to grow these communities, to open the doors to people who look like us, people who understood our culture, our food, our religious beliefs. We rented storefronts that were contextual to businesses because we knew that our tenants would shop there, would eat there, use the daycare center, the clinic, the doctor's office, all in a language that is familiar to them. We grew communities where there weren't any. As one owner put it, while the bullets were flying through our windows and crack dealers knew our names. In our case in Chinatown, at one time we were overrun by gangs. But we rented to low-income tenants, people who started families here. We subsidized with our own meager rents, millions of immigrants getting their first start in this country. And they thrive because of our personal sacrifices. It's our families that gave others the stability during hard times in the months after 9/11, during the blackout of Hurricane Sandy, the depression of 2008, and now during a global pandemic that no one could have predicted. We made our tenants' lives bearable during these times because unlike huge corporations, we know our tenants' names, we know their situations, and we were able to adapt. We check in on them. In my case, I worked with other Chinatown tenement owners to bring fresh groceries to our tenants' doorsteps during the height of the pandemic lockdown from a nearby food pantry that was set up as an emergency pantry. That pantry is likely in a building owned by a small family like mine. The vast majority of small property owners are like myself. We have good relationships with our tenants. We're providing the familiarity and the stability which is so vital at this time, when trauma and change of life can threaten especially older tenants. In many cases, we're the only people in their lives that check in on them. Safety is a really big, important priority in my community right now. With the rise of anti-Asian violence, which is undeniable, we work with the NYPD, community leaders, we make our communities safer, we advocate, and again, we provide a safe environment that we expect for ourselves. But we can't go on with no increases of rent any longer. Taxes have doubled for me in 10 years. Insurance has increased, water rates, practically everything that it takes to maintain my building. Brick and wood buildings that were built when Ulysses S. Grant was president, horse and carriages rumbled down Mott Street when my grandfather was here and even into my father's lifetime. That's how old these buildings are. And to expect us to maintain safe and stable housing with no increases after a global pandemic that has thrust our commercial tenants, many into oblivion, or at least a slow and painful death spiral that's unconscionable to do right now. Because after all, it's our vulnerable tenants who ultimately suffer along with us. I don't believe that that's what you want. We need you to advocate for us and to help our tenants by providing them the stability that they deserve. As we emerge from a pandemic, the alternative is a mass sell-off of small properties that will be bought by soulless corporations, entities that will harm the communities that have built New York, and essentially destabilize a lot of rent-regulated apartments. An increase of 5% is needed at this time to help us provide safe and stable housing needed as myself and our tenants struggle to safely emerge from our homes and back into our normal lives. I do want to address a question that was brought up by, I think it was Christina, was asking about some of the programs that were rolled out. And I just want to say as a personal experience of someone who tried to apply for the penalty decrease if we didn't pay our taxes on time. That was a proposal that was so clumsily rolled out that it took weeks and weeks and weeks of myself working with our local council member representatives, who then in turn tried to reach a Department of Finance. And I want to tell you that all throughout this year, the Department of Finance has been absolutely understaffed and totally unprepared for the legislation that was before them, where they absolutely could not get back to me in a timely manner. So to this day, I still have trouble working with them. Many weeks and months went by when we would try to apply for programs that were rolled out, only to find that no one had an answer for us. I also want to talk about the fact that small property owners, particularly those in communities of color, also hire tradesmen, people who maintain our buildings, who in turn, many times, are people of color. And they have been cut out of this because of the laws that started in 2019. HSTPA has put on such a suffocating blanket of economic disaster that even our tradesmen are left to be sitting on the couch when they really should be working. And if you talk to enough people in the trades, they'll tell you that they're spending less even in their own communities. And that has a ripple effect. When those people stop spending in the small businesses that we have, we collect less rent also. So these things that are being talked about really have a tremendous effect. And I urge you to really look at this situation in a holistic manner. With regard to David, I know that you're talking about this massive increase of money that's supposed to rain down on us. I just want to let you know that the administration of this is very difficult. I don't want you to be misled to think that once the floodgates are open, that the administration at the state and city level is going to run smoothly. It is not. It is absolutely not. And I am living proof of that. I've tried every which way to keep my family from going into debt. To say that we're going to rely on a system that runs smoothly like a Swiss watch, I can tell you this is not the case. And we may never see this for the next 12 months. This federal money that's supposed to be opening up like the gates of heaven, it's not going to happen for the small property owners like myself for a very long time. And that's why we need this increase now. We can't be lulled into complacency to think that just like the Department of Finance was supposed to get me a decrease from 18% to 7.5%. And I can show you the emails. I'd be happy to send you the emails to show you what a cumbersome process this has been. I do want to remind you that we're still under threat of lien sales. We're still under threat of the 18% penalties. So please be realistic and understand that small property owners, particularly those owners in the neighborhoods that we love, neighborhoods that we identify New York by, are under serious threat of no longer existing. And please work with us. We're very happy to share testimony from other small property owners like myself. I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Questions for Jan? Alex.
Hi, thank you. Quick question. So I think you may have implied something regarding the conflict or the sort of contradiction between the rent freeze that's implicit in or explicit in the rental assistance and whether or not the rent guidelines board can increase. So, but are you saying that if it's going to take so long for the rental assistance to come into place, that there's an opportunity for the rent guidelines board to increase rent, at which point it would be frozen by the rental assistance program? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I'm responding to David's comment about having a massive increase of money, over $1 billion coming from the feds. The administration of that, I don't want you to be misled to thinking that, that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks or months. In the meantime, many of our small property owners are carrying a huge debt load. And I know that many tenant advocates will always tell us, well, just take out a loan, go to the bank, you guys got mortgage relief. But in realistic terms, many of us don't qualify for a letter of credit. We don't qualify for many of the traditional programs that are out there. If we've been bleeding out for a year, any banker looking at our balance sheet, we're not showing a favorable, a loan opportunity here. So some of us have qualified for EIDL loans. Those came and went. Those were used up very quickly. And I know that there's a second infusion of a possibility of a of a second draw on the EIDL loans. Hopefully those will come through. I myself have applied for an increase, but again, this is a loan. And we're already, many of us are in debt to the city of New York to the tune of 18%. So we're talking about adding loans on top of loans without having grants that are actually forgivable. And so I just want to answer what David was saying about be realistic about the money that's coming. And the example that I can use is the $100 million that was recently released during the summer, of which only 40 or less than 50% of it was actually administered. And there's a number of reasons why that happens, but it's fairly typical of the clumsiness and the awkwardness of these rollouts. So we need to take that into consideration, that every day that goes by is more interest that's accruing and more people whose lives are at danger.
Christian.
Hi, John. Thank you for your testimony. What share of all rent stabilized owners do you think your members represent?
What share of the 900,000 units that we represent? I can only tell you from personal experience, Christian. I've started meeting with other SPONY members over the course of the pandemic, and perhaps this is one of the silver linings of being able to meet on Zoom, because we've met many dozens and dozens of them. I can't tell you the numbers out of the hundreds of members of SPONY, how many of them are small owners like me, because one of the issues that we are confronted with oftentimes when we speak to legislators is what is small. I know what small is because I operate a tenement building. There are landlords who own 5 or 6 tenement buildings, but they're still basically writing leases over the kitchen table. I mean, they're not managed by big corporate companies. We're essentially self-managed. As I said, I'm a 3rd generation person who's been writing those leases across the kitchen table and meeting with my tenants in my home. But I think that there's a clear distinction between us and the people who own several thousand units that have a different perspective on the whole thing.
Okay. Are there any sort of requirements as to, I mean, who gets to be a member of SPONY or not? I mean, it's like, do you have any, do you draw certain lines around this?
Well, I think that we tend to represent people, as I said, like myself, who are really family owned and managed, as opposed to someone who has the ability to, have $20,000, $30,000 retainers with management companies that are on, and a cadre of lawyers to answer all of the numerous agency things that they have to do. They really don't qualify, because we want to advocate and we want to represent people who are the lifeblood of New York, that own the majority of the rent stabilized housing. So in answer to your question, it's really more about family ownership and management than it is about the number of units.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Jan? Thank you, Jan.
Thank you so much.
So our last speaker for the invited owner groups is Marianne Rothman, Council of New York Cooperatives and Condominiums. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy for this opportunity to express our views. My name is Marianne Rothman. I'm the Executive Director of the Council of New York Cooperatives and Condominiums, which is a membership organization of more than 2,300 housing co-ops and condominiums located throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City and beyond. More than 175,000 New York families make their homes in these buildings. For over 40 years, my organization has provided education, information, and advocacy to our members and has tried to bring their needs to the attention of lawmakers and government agencies. Many of our members were converted from rental housing to co-ops and condos. Since 1982, rent-regulated tenants who opt not to purchase their units have generally had the right to stay on in their apartments. And even prior to that time, seniors and individuals with disabilities could exempt themselves from the conversion process and remain in their homes. As a result, there are rent-regulated units in many of our member co-ops and condos. In some cases, the rent-regulated apartments are now owned by the co-op or condo itself, often as a result of default by the sponsor. Rents from these units can be considerably less than the cost of operating them, which means that the cooperative or condominium must budget to cover the shortfall through carrying charges paid by the other shareholders or unit owners. And if the former sponsor or an investor owns multiple rent-regulated units in the building that have shortfalls, that owner is still responsible for paying full carrying charges for the unit, which means that there's always the risk of default by this underwater owner. Co-ops and condos are self-contained communities governed by volunteer boards elected by the shareholders or unit owners to set policy and to oversee the operation of the building. The board tries to do this in a way that provides quality housing at reasonable cost. Prudent cooperatives and condominiums will also try to set a budget that funds reserves to cover the constant need to repair and replace building systems. But beyond that, co-ops and condos operate at break even, which is why the operating costs of cooperatives and condominiums in New York City give good insight into the actual costs of operating similar rental buildings. Since 1980, the Council of New York Cooperatives and Condominiums has annually compiled a study of operating costs. And we sent you a copy of our comparative study of operating costs for the year 2019 as my first ever PDF of it. We collect financial data from co-ops and condos and compare on a dollars per room per year basis the various costs of operating these buildings. And while I was still listening attentively to what everyone was saying, I turned to our comparative study of 2019 operating costs to substantiate Basha's remarks about how much property taxes have increased. We divide, we report on, well, there's only, because of the pandemic, there's only a little over 1,000 different buildings in the 2019 study, and they're grouped in 8 categories: East Side cooperatives, West Side cooperatives, small cooperatives in Manhattan, that's 100 rooms or fewer, small cooperatives in Brooklyn, larger cooperatives outside of Manhattan, and condominiums in Manhattan and outside Manhattan, and lofts. The loft section is very small, but let me just, and then after the raw data, there's a 10-year recap for each of the categories. And that's where I want to call your attention for real estate taxes. So our 10-year recap goes from 2010 to 2019. For small Manhattan co-ops, real estate taxes were 36% of a typical budget in 2010. They are 43% of a typical budget in 2019. And in average dollar amounts, that means they went from $1,791 per room per year to $2,671 per room per year in 2019. Hardest hit with property taxes is the larger buildings on the east side of Manhattan. Their percentages of budget went from 36.5% in 2010 to 46% in 2019, but it's their dollar amounts that are astounding, averaging $2,280 per room per year in 2010, and rising to $3,491 per room per year in 2019. And we know that property assessments were set so early in 2020 that they anticipated a prosperous year and increases. So the property taxes shall have gone up again in 2020. So in brief, our chart, our report and its various charts clearly illustrate that operating costs increase year after year. If fuel prices drop, then government mandates eat up the budget. Labor costs increase annually, water rates keep rising, and property taxes continue to grow at a very fast pace. Yeah. For owners to be able to continue to operate rental properties, they must be able to collect rents that cover the ever-growing costs of operating their buildings, plus a margin of profit. When co-ops and condos own rent-regulated units, growing shortfalls between rent collected and actual costs impose a hardship on all the other owners. We urge the Rent Guidelines Board to allow rent increases attuned to the costs of operating property in New York City today, and we appreciate this opportunity to express our views.
Thank you, Marianne. Questions for Marianne? Marianne, I don't want to say that it's the end of a long day, but that may be a reflection of a long day.
It's okay.
Yes, Marianne, I have a question. So where you're talking about study done for these co-ops and condos, are these 100% rent, or are there, some of them are owner?
For a co-op or a condo to exist, there have to be at least 15% of the units owned by individual owners. But even 50 years after the first wave of converting rental buildings from to co-ops and condos, many of our member buildings still have quite a number of rent-regulated tenants, though I would venture to say that just about none of them have as much as 35% rent-regulated tenants. So the buildings are mostly owner occupied, but still have some rental tenants.
Right, and then the taxes assessed on these buildings are the same taxes that the owners pay for, right? It's the same tax that.
Oh, okay.
Right.
In a co-op, the Department of Finance will set taxes on the whole building. And then each person who lives in the co-op is assigned an apartment to live in, and they're assigned a certain number of shares that reflects the size of their apartment and other amenities that they may have. And the co-op board or the manager divides up all of the costs of operating the building among those shareholders based on the proportion that they own. So yes, together, all the people who live in a co-op or in a co-op pay the tax bill. Actually, in a condo, it's different because each condo is its own piece of property, and the Department of Finance actually sends a tax bill to each individual owner.
They pay it directly to the Department of Finance, right?
Other questions for Marianne? Okay, thank you, Marianne. I guess to the members of the board, any other questions for our guests? All right, well, I'm not one to scorn some free extra minutes. So I would just like to say thank you all for your testimony, and it was really very helpful for us. As you can see, all of us are trying to think through, what is, a difficult, just a really difficult decision-making process, particularly given the interplay between the data we have and recent events. And so your insights has been very helpful to us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. And we hope you continue to stay well. Looking forward to continuing conversations throughout the remainder of the few months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time after a long day.
Thank you. So, Shayla, I'm totally forgetting what we were talking about. Was there something that we wanted to cover other than the testimony that we heard, or
I mean, I didn't know if we were gonna have like general board discussion of everything we've heard today, but I also want to recognize that we've had a really long day.
Yeah.
So we can definitely continue this dialogue, but I wanted to flag that we have the preliminary vote next week. And it feels like even from the testimony this morning, we still have a lot of questions that we have. We also heard, I think, a lot of testimonies from my view, and I don't know if, for example, Scott would want to, I have a lot of reaction to the landlord testimony that I would like to sort of talk through. Not necessarily with the folks testifying because they're testifying on what they're testifying, but I feel like to your point earlier, David, I heard a lot of things that were different than what we've seen in other reports and in other testimony. And I find that very difficult to come to terms as we head into the preliminary vote and still have all of these questions and dialogue that we haven't had. So
I'm totally open to the conversation. I'm also totally open to the fact that people may be, 6 hours of meetings is a lot for one day. So I guess I'm going to follow everyone else's lead as to how we should proceed right now.
David, I did just want to go over before people start disappearing, just what we're voting on Wednesday, May 5th, just to clarify that this is what we need to do.
Yeah, and also just timeline, Andrew, for us, because it feels like it's like next week.
It doesn't only feel like it's next week, it is next week. So, yeah, so there's
It's next month.
It's next month, right? There you go. No, it's just that I'm going to be sending around the proposed language for both orders, which is order number 53 for the apartments and lofts and order number 51 for hotels. So everyone's veteran that's been on this board. So the things we have to do at the preliminary are set proposed guidelines for apartments for 1 and 2 year lease renewals, for lofts, 1 and 2 year lease renewals, and the special guideline for units coming out of rent control that are going into rent stabilization. And the fourth thing is the adjustment for hotels, for all 5 classes of hotels. So that's what we're responsible to do. And it, as I was discussed earlier today, our current orders do include units that become vacant. That is up to the board whether or not they want that our order would apply to those vacant units. That's a decision the board can make.
So Andrew, could you just kind of clarify, because I think it's not necessarily super clear for everyone what that means. That's as opposed to the old law that allowed for a separate vacancy increase. Go ahead.
So the interpretation of the laws in 2019 by HCR was that local RGBs can state in their order or apply those renewal lease adjustments to units that become vacant. Last year, that was the case with our order. So it's not a vacancy controlled by the state anymore. It's not a separate guideline that this board can set. We can't set a separate vacancy allowance for those units, but it can be the same as what the renewal lease adjustments are for that unit.
So just to be clear, if we voted a 1% for a renewal lease, then that 1% would also increase a vacancy lease.
Correct.
By the same percentage.
Can do that. Yeah.
By 1%.
By
So
1%.
if you had two apartments next to each other, one was a renewal and one was and they both had the same rent. They both had $1,000 a month rent. And then you had a 1% increase, they both go up to $1,010.
Correct. Yeah. So those are the things that we have to vote on. And so I'll send around those proposed language. Generally, you can just put whatever percentage out there. There's no, unlike the final vote where we have to put out, what the board is considering 72 hours prior to the vote. That's not the case with a preliminary. You can just, as a member of the board, put forth a guideline suggestion. And then, we need 5 yeses for anything to pass. And then that would go. So whatever proposal gets those 5 votes, then that would be the preliminary guideline. So, and generally speaking, the apartment loss takes in current years, and in the last 20 years or so, the apartment, the lofts, and the special guideline all at once. That's why we generally have 2 votes, one on the order itself, and one on the hotel. The one on the apartment and loft that includes all that, and then one on the hotel guide. So I'll get that language to you tomorrow was my plan. So that will be sent out. And a voting sheet will be accompanying that, so you can track how people are voting in real time. You can, mark off how the votes are going. So. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, veterans, if you have any questions in the meantime, please let me know and we'll answer them.
And any other, being totally open to Shayla's point, anybody else want to share anything? No pressure for me to say yes, just I just want to make sure people get an opportunity to speak if they would like to.
I mean, maybe the question is, are people open to hearing someone else speak too? Because I had a lot of reactions to all of the testimony we had, and I can definitely reach out to folks individually. But there were a lot of assertions on rent stabilization, and the state should have the decision on this, but then we're hearing board undo the vacancy that was withdrawn from the state, but use this venue to increase on vacancy. So I feel like there were a lot of ideas brought up by the landlords that I would like to discuss. And I also don't know where other board members fall on whether this is a thing that they are considering. To me, it seems like we're being asked to ignore what happened on the state, but FYI, we can't do MCIs and we're going to be hurting because of those things. So take that into account and increase rent. So I feel like I heard both those things, and I couldn't come to terms with like where other folks are at so close to a vote.
Shayla, I think you may have hit a wall, a 315 wall.
I mean, that's fine. I would just like ask for folks to also want to, to make themselves available, because I feel like we have to, it's Wednesday next week. We're already on Thursday. So we have the weekend and 2 additional days before we can all have dialogue on where people are at and why they're there, and really look at the data. And so it just feels like this is an off year unless folks have decided, and then I'm happy to have that conversation also.
Just so, Shayla, just so you don't feel like you're talking to a wall. I mean, it's at least speaking for myself. I also see what you're seeing. I mean, it's like there's a lot of conflicting information. Every single report, I mean, it's like has sort of a slightly different message. And so there is a lot to consider, but I feel like we have a lot to take in, unfortunately, in a really short amount of time. So yeah, speaking for myself, like, yes, I'd like to make myself available to talk through some of these things and to get some clarification, but I feel like it's probably not going to happen in the next 15 minutes. But yeah, just
I would also be interested if folks want to share, like there were a lot of, I think, interpretation of our reports that I don't necessarily agree with, also interpretation of other people's reports to make points. And I would be open to hearing if folks are like, I heard this data over the weekend and I would like to hear if there's other data to explain that or context that I need to hear for us to be able to do that research. I don't want us to sit at the plenary vote and say, well, we didn't get a chance to talk, so this is why I'm landing here, because that doesn't feel like the right place for us to be at. And then the final vote will approach a lot faster. So it feels like we're in a bit of a rush to make sure that we're responding with data and facts as much as possible, especially to the claims that I honestly, I will,
Yeah.
I will react thoughtfully, but it seemed a little outrageous to me as well.
So I'm with you. I know that we heard Vito speaking. We asked them to provide the list of the costs that they're having on the side that were not reported, that they're not accounted for. And then we hear also, what's this other person? We hear, Joseph also, who has some data that he's going to send it to us, right? So it's, and I get you, there's a lot of conflicted information. And again, like every year, we hear about costs that were not reflected in the report that the RGB, based on the research they have provided to the board, right? We hear this every year. And then, the information that we receive from CPC and the information that we received from the banks was very, very, very informative. And what we're hearing is kind of like the contrary. I'm very confused, just like you are. Yeah, so I'm with you.
I mean, one thing I'd like to get more clarity on is just, I mean, I know this question has been asked in several ways to different people in several contexts, but what are the indicators of distress? I mean, there's a lot that can be said about, which costs fit in which bucket. I mean, it's like, how are they accounted for, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's maybe an increased cost in one area might be covered by a decrease in another, but it seems like we don't really have a window into how exactly that happens. And it's probably likely to be very individual from building to building. So is there anything that we can know on the aggregate in terms of distress? Or lead ups to distress? I mean, is there something that we can really know around that?
And Andrew, the board right now, our reports describe distress, and the way we use distress as of now, my understanding is that that's financial, not physical, correct?
Correct. In the INE, the distressed property is one where expenses exceed income. And that's what we define as distress. In the back of that report, you can also see we in deciles, different levels of, the number of owners that are 90 cents on a dollar are going toward expense, or 80 cents, and it goes down the line. So if your definition of distress is like, yeah, okay, would a building still be considered distress if 90 cents on every dollar is going to O&M costs? So, there's different ways that you can look at distress, but what we define as distressed in our INE report is just if expenses exceed income.
Christian, I would just say, and I'm also just kind of trying to think this through, I would say that we've identified 4 indicia of distress, but we don't have good data on any of them. So from the lenders that we heard from, it would be defaults and forbearances. But I think Leah made a good point last time that we're talking about a relatively small number of buildings. So I don't know, I don't know what that means for the city overall, but there's like a hint of it. And that the hint was more in and then there was a hint of those factors. But then the other 2 indicia of distress that I have come to see from the testimony we've heard would be collections and vacancy rate. And so we saw some issue with collections both from the lender portfolios, but then that was kind of mixed, which is a point I think that Shayla made last time. And then we also saw from CHIP that they said that there was collection issues. But then interestingly, like the new law may address collection issues to some extent on a retroactive basis. But then the remaining indicia, which is vacancies, if landlords had a big increase in vacancies, that's money that they're never going to get back. And I would think that would probably be a big driver of decreased gross income. And that's, again, we don't have good data on it, but that's something that worries me, is that if you have a vacancy rate that goes from 3% to 10%, we could kind of estimate, I guess, your loss in income to some extent, but we don't have good data on it. So those are some of my preliminary thoughts.
I mean, I think the challenge for the vacancy portion is that we will see that data eventually will catch up. And so we can make shifts if we have to, but if it was vacant, they're not going to get money from the rent relief program. It doesn't matter if we increase rents this year, that money is gone, and there's no, I think it's something to look at as an indicator, but it feels like on my end, it feels like to focus on that without actually saying, also, all of those units will likely all get rented up. Even though the city saw a lot of people leave, the overall population stayed the same. And so, when people start getting back their jobs, I'm assuming we'll see people fill in those units. And if they're not being filled, I think that's an indicator then. But we're not out of the pandemic. So having an expectation that we would see a jump in that, a huge jump in that would be unrealistic. And then to me, I think the lender's testimony was really important because it also showed that they're keeping an eye, but they're not saying, oh, something is wrong right in this moment, even though it's a smaller group of folks. But that's actually, to me, as far as data, the best grouping of data, because you want to show the person lending you money that you're doing well or not well, so that they can help and support in that way. The CHIP data, I feel like we didn't talk about where the data was. Was it self-reporting? Did they select who? Where is the concentration? Including the SPONY, I think it was very woke testimony, but it doesn't actually get at the heart that we're seeing mass displacement of tenants in Chinatown. And folks who are organizing and doing work in Chinatown aren't seeing units vacant in order to vacate, to keep a building vacant so that they can remodel and bring them up to, higher rents. And so it was a little bit I think that there is a lot of conflicting data, and I think I'm happy to talk about any specific portion of it. I'm also happy to bring in research to paint the other picture or to put some of this data into context, because I feel like just looking at the vacancies, that would be the same to say, let's help every store that lost funding or money during the pandemic. Let's make sure that tenants' costs didn't go up too. There's just a lot that we would have to do if we wanted to take that as just the reality.
I have a question for Andrew. Andrew, so do we have, I don't know, it's kind of it's such a short time, right? So I don't know if we have a chance to get a testimony from another bank.
Well, we certainly can, in a short period of time, we can't. But remember, this is a preliminary guideline, and
right.
Final guideline will be made in June. And we can certainly bring in folks to talk further on these kind of things. But in order to do a public discussion of what's going on, no, we don't have the time to do that, because just between the public notice and setting up another meeting, there's no way possible to do that before the.
Andrew, I think when we
wanted to say, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Leah.
I wanted to say, in my experience, it is a preliminary guideline, but and I really don't know why people stick to this, but a lot of folks don't like to go whatever the guideline is. So, for example, if the lowest that the preliminary guideline holds is a 1% for 1-year leases and a higher percent for 2-year leases, and then when it's time for the preliminary vote, folks are really reticent to do anything below the 1% for the final vote, claiming that they don't want to do anything lower than what we did in the pre-vote. So I just wanted to point that out. And maybe we should have a discussion about that, because I don't really know if it's really proper. But that was in response really to Cecilia's point of getting more information and the point made about that we have a plenary vote, but after that, we can always have the final vote.
Andrew, could you comment on, I'm speaking to Leah's point, on the guidance that we've received from the law department in terms of the relationship between the final vote and the preliminary vote? And then I'm also going to ask Assistant Commissioner Jaffe from HBD said that she might be able to get us some data about the performance of HBD's portfolio. It would be great if we could see that before the preliminary vote. That would just be one more not small, data point about how buildings are performing.
Maybe not as important data, but I was really floored by some of the comments made by Basha and some of the data that she cited. So I would really want to, she sort of read through those numbers fairly quickly, and I would want to be able to like see her testimony and if that data is cited anywhere.
Yeah, she recently sent her testimony over. I just got it at 3:08. So I can forward it to you guys.
Andrew.
So in terms of a preliminary, it's a guideline that folks who want to comment on what this board is doing has an idea of what, a number to comment on, right? So if you have a range that the board has set up, it's that's what they're commenting on, a range. So I guess bear that in mind when you're thinking about a range, that if you feel like it should be, a bit of a wider range because you're having that issue of not having everything we have yet, and if it's a range you want to go with, you can do. If it's a single number, it like last year there were single numbers there. We're not beholden to that number. So you can go off that number because it's a preliminary. The whole idea is it's public comment. There's hearings. So, those numbers can change. And so that's fine. The idea of a range is that here's the range that people can really comment on, and they want to comment on that range. Then if going outside that range, are they commenting on that range? I guess that's more of an issue. But, if something like if we had our preliminary vote in May of last year and a pandemic hit in the beginning of June, I'm not so sure that you couldn't have gone off outside a range that we did. I mean, there can be circumstances that certainly would allow you to go without in that range. So,
but it's not statutory, right? Like
no,
us having to vote with
no,
them.
it's not statutory. But again, the purpose of that range is for people to comment on that range. So
for example, if we were to vote for zeros across the board in the preliminary vote, we could, in theory, hear landlord testimony, tenant testimony, and LAT 1 and 2 for the final vote.
yes, yeah, that's how it works. Yeah, if you do a single number, then you can go off that number, no question. Now, if you go to 10% and 20%, then that would be okay, then you didn't comment on that. But if you're commenting on a zero and it ends up the same guideline, for example, now where it's 0 and rent freeze for 2, for everyone, and then an increase in the second year for 2-year leases, that's very different than saying, okay, now we're going to do 10% for 1-year lease and 20% for 2-year lease. So that, are you really truly being able to comment if it was 0, 0.
So just so that I'm clear, if we wanted to do a guideline like last year, we wouldn't necessarily have to have the exact numbers in the preliminary vote.
Correct.
In order to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. If it's a single, like if we did it like last year, you can get off that number. Again, going to something like 10% and 20%, that becomes problematic.
Any other comments from board members or questions?
I feel like I'll put everyone out of their misery and I maybe motion to close the meeting for the first time in 8 years.
Now we need a second.
Before you close this, I will send around the most recent contact information I have for everybody. So you know, the rule is that, you know, you can meet up to 4 outside of a meeting. After that, it's no longer legal. So you'd have to do it in
Does
public.
that include Zoom?
Yeah, sure. You can meet on Zoom. Yeah. And if you want me to help facilitate that, I can certainly do that as well.
And the 4 people rule includes Zoom and calls, correct?
Correct. Yeah, if it was a combination of the 2, that's fine. Yeah, but it can only total up to 4.
All right, so we have a motion. Do we have a second?
A second.
All right. Thank you all for a long day, and I will